Hello, Block here. Now, I don't normally appear on camera in my videos. I don't have the best camera setup, but I thought for this I would make an exception. I've been known to cover various RPGs on my channel, and for years I've wanted to delve into the widely popular Final Fantasy franchise. I grew up loving these games, and many of them rank among my absolute favorite gaming experiences. The problem I've had, though, is deciding where do I start and exploring these games in video form. I could start with the latest entry, or perhaps a personal favorite, or even let my community vote on it. There's so many options. In part, to solve this conundrum and to celebrate the franchise as a whole, I've decided to start where it all began, with the original Final Fantasy that released on the Nintendo Famicom and Nintendo Entertainment System. But this video series won't be like my standard reviews, as I seek to chronicle each of the main games of the Final Fantasy Anthology, exploring their themes, their characters, the evolution of gameplay, and storytelling between each game, and ultimately celebrate the franchise's legacy in the video game community. As with all of my videos, I aim to make each one of these approachable for both veterans and newcomers to the series. However, I do want to warn that there will be more spoilers than I typically do during these discussions. I do this not to ruin the experience for anyone, but quite the opposite, to share insights that I believe can elevate the games for all players, be it your first time or if you've enjoyed it more times than you can count. I know not everyone loves spoilers though, so if you want to skip these sections, look for a prompt on the screen to tell you where to fast forward to. This passion project of mine seems appropriate to undertake now, as 2022 marks 35 years since the original game released in Japan. There are a few video game franchises that have left their mark on the industry, like this Japanese RPG series from Square. To date, the franchise has encompassed 15 numbered titles, with a 16th on the way, along with numerous spin-offs, sequels, remakes, ports, and plenty more. The series has sold more than 164 million units worldwide, making it the 12th best-selling video game franchise of all time. As with most any hugely popular series, Final Fantasy has transcended beyond just video games, too. There have been anime, manga, novels, trading card games, a radio drama, and even a feature-length film. So, with that being said, join me, won't you, as we take a journey into a realm of all-powerful crystals, brave heroes, and unforgettable villains, through vicious rebellions against brutal empires, conflicts between the wonders of nature and technology, and struggles involving faith, honor, and pure love. Journey with me into the world of Final Fantasy. Hironobu Sakaguchi was born in 1962 in the city of Hitachi, located in the Ibaraki Prefecture in Japan. Growing up, Sakaguchi enjoyed collecting and polishing rocks, reading from his mother's large library, and studying music. He had played the piano since elementary school, and in high school he joined a folk band, playing guitar. Music, Sakaguchi felt, was a very hard profession to become profitable in, thus he enrolled in the Yokohama National University as a computer science major, hoping to learn coding so as to profit off of Japan's emerging computer market. It was here that he would meet Hiromichi Tanaka, a classmate who had much more experience in computing and video games than Sakaguchi. In fact, prior to their meeting, Sakaguchi had little to no interest in video gaming whatsoever. It was after meeting Tanaka, however, and being introduced to the video game wizardry, that Sakaguchi fell in love with the experiences video games could deliver. Wizardry was a Dungeons & Dragons style role-playing game developed by Americans Andrew Greenberg and Robert Woodhead. The game is credited as being the very first party-based RPG, allowing players to create a party of up to 6 characters, and then guide them out into a fantasy world of grand adventure. Sakaguchi was immediately hooked, so hooked in fact, that he would often skip class just to consume more of this spectacular video game on Tanaka's Apple II computer. In late 1983, during their third year of study at university, Sakaguchi and Tanaka were searching for part-time work in the electronics sector. It was around this time that Denyu Sha, a Japanese electric power conglomerate, had spun off a new company to focus on creating software in the burgeoning video game market. This was not uncommon, as Japan was undergoing a technological and economic renaissance, and companies of all varieties were finding ways to carve out their own piece of the pie, be it manufacturing televisions, computers, radios, or even video games. This company's name was Square. Formed by Masafumi Miyamoto, Square sought to do things a little differently than the competition. Most video games at the time were designed by a single developer who would code the game, and the finished product was then sent off to others within the company to come up with artwork, advertising, and in some cases, even storyboards. Miyamoto believed that Square, being a small startup, could differentiate itself by having all of these creators in a single location, and that they could collaborate together to craft a more cohesive product. This vision appealed to both Sakaguchi and Tanaka. That, and Square being such a new company, it didn't have the strenuous standards of larger competitors such as Namco and Konami. With Square, the duo felt that they would have a bit more freedom to experiment and ease into the industry, especially for Sakaguchi and his lack of programming knowledge. After an informal interview, Miyamoto was impressed by their passion, and both were hired on the spot. Sakaguchi, however, still dreamed of becoming a musician, but believed that this new job opportunity could provide him with the perfect amount of income and job experience to further his profession. Thus, he and Tanaka chose to drop out of Yokohama National University shortly after being hired in order to focus their attention on programming video games for Square. Sakaguchi cut his teeth on programming video games by creating an unlicensed adaptation of the Japanese television game show Touren Ingen. It was later, in 1984, when he became part of the team for Square's first official title, The Death Trap. The game was a text adventure for the NEC PC 8801, NEC PC 9801, and the Fujitsu FM7 brand of computers, and revolved around a spy infiltrating an unnamed East African country during the Cold War, tasked with preventing biological warfare. Sakaguchi was initially tasked with doing clerical work for the senior programmers. However, he found himself soon elevated to producer, as the other part-time employees focused less and less attention to Square's software. Although The Death Trap received little attention upon its release, it's notable for being one of the few text-adventure games to use large, still, full-screen images to provide graphical immersion in between scenes. The game, despite the little fanfare, did prove successful, and almost immediately after release, Square ordered a sequel, which came to be titled Wheel: The Death Trap 2. During the production of The Death Trap, Sakaguchi's fascination with music led him to seek a composer to provide tunes for some of Square's games. The technology at the time wasn't advanced enough for much more than short jingles and themes, so it was difficult finding someone who could be dedicated for such a small project. It was during this search that Sakaguchi became acquainted with Nobuo Uematsu, a self-taught musician who worked at a nearby cassette rental store. There are some conflicting accounts concerning exactly how Uematsu and Sakaguchi came to know each other, but Uematsu states that at the time he often invited artists of all types, from musicians to dancers and even programmers, over to his apartment at night to drink and share their dreams for the future. One of these guests was a woman who was already working at Square, and after one of these nightly talks, Uematsu's demo tape ended up in Square's hands. Uematsu would soon agree to work with Square on various projects, though he considered it at the time just a side gig to provide some extra cash. Following Will the Death Trap 2, Square produced many small projects that garnered very little attention. While some of these games weren't outright bombs, they provided just enough income to keep the company afloat until the next title could be released. In 1986, Square separated from Denyu Shaw and became its own independent company, and as an independent, Square focused on releasing a steadier stream of titles. Sakaguchi worked on many of these, but he had become discouraged because the vast majority of these games were action-based, which he disliked. Sakaguchi still remembered the joy that wizardry brought him back in university, and he wanted to create a game that offered the same kind of experience. Miyamoto, however, wasn't convinced that such a project would be profitable and always turned down Sakaguchi's pitches for a role-playing game. All of this changed in 1986 when the gaming company Enix produced Dragon Quest for the Nintendo Famicom. Developed by Chunsoft, the game was an instant hit in the Japanese market and laid the groundwork for most all RPGs that followed. It had a top-down camera perspective, random encounters, turn-based combat, a major quest that intersects with numerous side quests, a spell system that incrementally grows stronger, the use of hit points and experience points, and the ability to obtain more powerful equipment. The plot, too, was acclaimed, as while it focused on the outset on a brave warrior setting out to rescue a captured princess, a new objective is revealed only after the initial quest is complete. Scenario writers in video games suddenly had become much more important. The Japanese RPG had been born. That same year also saw the release of Nintendo's massive action RPG, The Legend of Zelda. These two behemoth successes were enough to finally convince Miyamoto to move forward in production of Square's very own role-playing game, with Sakaguchi serving as director and lead writer, and Tanaka as lead designer. Although Sakaguchi had Miyamoto's approval, development on this new RPG project was anything but smooth sailing. Sakaguchi had built a reputation as being a rough boss who demanded the most out of his co-workers regardless of his previous unsuccessful projects. Initially, only 3 of his colleagues agreed to work with him, but eventually the project grew to a staff of 7 core members that were referred to within Square as the A-Team. Koichi Ishii joined the team as a lead designer and contributed to the game in many ways, but primarily as the game's planner and battle graphics designer. Ishii developed the crystals that would become an overarching theme across the entire franchise. Akitoshi Kawazu was in charge of the combat system, which he based heavily on both wizardry and the tabletop RPG Dungeons & Dragons. It was he who advocated early on that the player be able to freely create their own party from the ground up, as that, in his opinion, was where the most fun lay. While Sakaguchi created the basis for the game's story, Kenji Terada took charge in really fleshing out the plot, writing the smaller details, and giving voice to the game's numerous NPCs. Yoshitaka Amano was hired as the game's character designer. Sakaguchi was looking for an art style akin to Western-based comic books. Koichi Ishii actually first suggested Amano for the role of lead artist, but Sakaguchi shot him down due to never having heard of him. Shortly thereafter, when comparing notes with each other, Sakaguchi showed some art to Ishii saying, "This is what I want," and Ishii exclaimed, "That's Yoshitaka Amano's work." Amano had already established himself by providing artwork for the Vampire Hunter D novel and movie adaptation in Japan, as well as the anime adaptation of Speed Racer. Thus, he was seen as a natural choice for bringing Sakaguchi's characters to life. For music, Sakaguchi considered no one else but Nobuo Uematsu for the role. Uematsu had dreamed of working on a project where he could really flex his musical talents and explore greater themes than what video games tended to allow. RPGs gave him that opportunity. In a role-playing game, there are many different characters, different scenarios, and different types of gameplay, all requiring different music. As composer, he could create grandiose movie-style themes for important plot scenes, or playful music for the comedic moments. Battles really appealed to him as well because he could experiment with progressive rock sounds to make the combat even more exciting. Lastly, Iranian-American programmer Nasir Jabeli was brought on board to code the game. Nasir was already a veteran in the industry at a time when few could make that claim. He had considerable experience in the United States, creating more than 12 games, mostly on the Apple II. Jabeli had retired from making games after the infamous video game crash of 1983, but after witnessing the power of the Nintendo Entertainment System, he grew excited to program once again. Jabeli had a friend who had contacts with Square in Japan and eagerly went to work for them, developing a few titles before taking a role on the company's most ambitious project. Initially, he had difficulty coding the title due to the complexity of the gameplay, but Sakaguchi advised him to just focus on programming and not understanding all aspects of the game, which inevitably made the process run much more smoothly for all parties. Though Sakaguchi had assembled a noteworthy team to bring this RPG creation to life, many within Square had a lack of faith in their success. The amount of resources being attributed to bring this ambitious title to fruition soured relations internally. Thus, the A-team became quite unpopular. This only served to motivate Sakaguchi and his staff even more. Meanwhile, Hiromichi Tanaka was busy with his own games and leading many others on their own projects, while Sakaguchi was indisposed on this RPG project. Eventually, towards the end of development, Tanaka would bring on a group labeled the B-Team to help polish the game and get it out the door. On December 8th, 1987, the game known as Final Fantasy first hit Japanese store shelves. For decades, rumors have swirled on how the game received that title. It was once believed that it was named as such because it was going to be Sakaguchi's last game, that he would retire from programming once this project was done. In a 2015 interview, however, Sakaguchi disputed those claims. Sakaguchi states that from the very beginning he wanted a game that could be shortened simply to FF. This was so that the title could be abbreviated in the Latin script and pronounced in just 4 syllables in the Japanese language as Efu Efu. To capture the Western inspiration of the title, the name Fighting Fantasy was initially chosen, but it was later found out that there was already a tabletop game of that name that was created in 1982. Final Fantasy was then chosen as the eventual title, again largely because Sakaguchi liked the way that it sounded. Still, there is likely a grain of truth to that old rumor. As already uncovered, Sakaguchi had grown displeased working on action titles and other games that didn't interest him. After working on his dream project, had it not been successful, it's entirely plausible that he would have left Square and the video game industry for good. Secondly, Square had been treading water financially for some time, and the threat of bankruptcy was always a reality. With the larger-than-normal budget being used towards Sakaguchi's RPG project, it's entirely believable that, had Final Fantasy failed, Square would have gone under as a company sooner rather than later. Of course, Final Fantasy was a huge success, and it helped lead the way for role-playing games to become one of the most popular genres on the Japanese market. A great darkness shrouded the world. The wind died. The sea raged. The earth began to decay. Only a prophecy kept hope alive in people's hearts. When darkness veils the world, 4 warriors of light shall come. And after journeying far, 4 young warriors did at last appear. In the hands of each rested a mysterious crystal. Final Fantasy tells the story of 4 warriors of light, heroes chosen by the almighty crystals to embark on a quest to restore balance to the world. The crystals each govern an elemental that's essential to sustaining the world: fire, earth, wind, and water. An evil force called Chaos has corrupted the crystals, however, robbing them of their power and gifting their essences to each of 4 vile lieutenants who call themselves the 4 Fiends. In response to this, the crystals summon 4 heroes to restore them to their former glory and save the world from destruction. Unlike other games of its time, which typically focus on a singular quest for the player to complete, Final Fantasy excels in creating a complex, believable world by telling little stories in each of the game's segments. Final Fantasy can feel more like a fantasy novel than a game at times, with each area serving as a chapter of a larger story by telling a smaller, more confined tale within. For instance, the heroes first arrive in the kingdom of Cornelia and are tasked with rescuing the Princess Sarah, who has been kidnapped by a wicked knight named Garland. Later, they arrive in the land of Melmond and must venture into the nearby caves to slay a vicious vampire who preys upon the area. When first booting up the game, players are greeted by a mystical, enchanting theme that has come to be known as the Final Fantasy Prelude. Nobuo Uematsu admits that this song was composed at the last minute when Sakaguchi requested something unique to be played on the title screen. Within about 10 minutes, Uematsu delivered this now iconic song, which continues to be used in Final Fantasy titles to this very day. The theme is a series of arpeggios, broken chords played in a rising or descending order. The result is a simplistic melody that seemingly lulls you into the game's fantastical setting. In contrast, the first song that Uematsu wrote for Final Fantasy was a triumphant anthem that became the series' main theme. Uematsu states that he didn't intend for it to become the main theme for the game, much less for the entire franchise, but it was such a big hit with the game's staff. Because of its importance to the overall team, it only felt right for it to represent the game as a whole. As previously stated, the developers really wanted players to be able to create their own party from scratch, as was the norm for RPGs of the era. In addition to naming their characters, the player must choose a class for their party members. The original Final Fantasy is rather weak in diversity, featuring only 6 classes that were largely staples of the genre to that point, though characters can be upgraded into more powerful versions of that class late in the game. The Warrior, sometimes referred to as the Fighter, is your standard tank class. They are specialists in heavy weapons and armor, built to withstand blows and protect the rest of their squad. Later, they can be upgraded to the Knight, a class that can also cast basic healing spells in addition to wielding the mightiest weapons and armor. The Monk, or Black Belt in some versions, is a martial artist that does not need weapons in order to dish out punishment. Though much more fragile than the Warrior, the Monk can deliver crushing blows with just their fists, and can often hit multiple times in a single turn. Later, they evolve into the Master class, able to equip armor that cannot encumber them and can deal some devastating damage. The Thief is a fast and agile fighter, able to deal crippling hits due to their high luck, and can more effectively evade attacks compared to the rest of the party. Thieves also possess the ability to flee from combat. When upgraded to the deadly Ninja class, these characters enjoy boosted stats, the capability to equip most every weapon and most armor, and they may even use damaging black magic spells. The White Mage serves perhaps the most important role in any party, as it is with their healing spells that the party remains healthy and prepared for battle. White magic not only cures wounds, but can protect those from harm, boost stats, transport the party out of dungeons, and severely damage undead foes. White mages can use hammers to do minor damage to enemies, but only in the most desperate of situations. After becoming a white wizard, these healers can cast massively helpful spells, including the offensive white magic spell Holy, one of the most devastating in the entire series. In contrast to the healer, the Black Mage specializes in offensive spells, and hitting an enemy with magic that they are weak against is often the key to victory. Their defense is especially low, however, and they attack with weapons even more poorly. As the Black Wizard, these spellcasters learn the top-tier black magic spells, including Flare or Nuke in the original NES release, which has the highest damage output in the game. Finally, there's the Red Mage, a magic user that can cast both healing and damaging spells, but never gaining access to the best abilities of either. Still, their flexibility makes them much more beginner-friendly, and they maintain their usefulness in any situation. When becoming the Red Wizard, they also have the stats to match with the Warrior, making them an all-around jack-of-all-trades. Although there aren't any canonical names for the protagonists, there are some names from official sources that fans have gravitated towards. In the original NES manual for the Western release of the game, Nintendo suggested using a party of a warrior, monk, and black and white mages, with the names Nest, Hoa, Phil, and Tommy, respectively. In 1989, a manga adaptation of the game featured a red mage named Puffy, a monk called Fritz, a robot named DB6, and Bahamut, the King of Dragons, as their 4 warriors of light. Likewise, a novelization of the first 3 games was released as part of the 25th anniversary in 2012. Titled Memory of Heroes, the novel reused the names Puffy and Fritz, and added a warrior named Zest, and a thief called Sauber, a black mage named Daewoo, and Flo, the white mage. Due to the party being entirely up to the player, Final Fantasy's stars are its colorful supporting cast. The Warriors of Light will encounter numerous people on their adventure, both friends and foes, and it is these characters that make the game such a memorable experience. The Oracle, Lucan, leads the Circle of Sages, and it is his prophecy that foretells that the world will fall into darkness, only to be restored to light when the crystals summon 4 brave heroes. Another standout is the pirate captain Beck, who orders an attack on the coastal city of Pravica. When the warriors defeat him, he realizes the error of his criminal ways and relinquishes his ship so the party may travel to the lands across the ocean. There is also Astos, the evil king of the Dark Elves. This cunning villain places a curse on the Prince of Elfheim, which puts him in eternal slumber, and steals the magical crystal eye from the witch Matoya so as to prevent her from crafting an antidote. Astos then poses as a weakling, tasking the warriors to retrieve a magical crown from the depths of the dangerous marsh cave before turning on the heroes when they return. Astos isn't the only villain in the game, however, and the main antagonist is perhaps the original Final Fantasy's most notable character. Garland is an accomplished knight who once swore fealty to the kingdom of Cornelia. Sometime prior to the appearance of the 4 Warriors of Light, Garland set off on a journey, only to return with malice in his heart. The original Japanese text leaves this journey vague, but the English and future translations state that the kingdom's princess, Sarah, rejected Garland despite his status as being the kingdom's most fearless and skilled warrior. Thus he set out on an adventure in order to earn her hand. It is unknown exactly what he accomplished, but the fact of the matter is, Sarah still turned him down, thus sending Garland into a fury. He abducts the princess, retreats to the nearby Chaos Shrine, and demands the king hand over control of the kingdom in exchange for his daughter's life. The quest to rescue Sarah is the first task given to the Warriors of Light, and Garland serves as the game's first boss battle. After his defeat, our heroes continue their journey traversing the world and defeating the four fiends of chaos before returning to the Chaos Shrine. Here, the Dark Crystal opens a portal, one that provides a pathway to the distant past. It is in this realm, 2,000 years removed from the present, that the warriors encounter Garland yet again. Garland reveals that, on the brink of death from their battle, he was transported by the Dark Crystal to this distant world and was bestowed the power of darkness in order to sustain him. With his newfound abilities, Garland summons the four fiends and unleashes them into the world, creating a time loop that will allow him to ultimately live forever. In the final battle, Garland absorbs all of the power from the defeated four fiends and transforms into pure chaos. It's only with this being's defeat that the time loop can be closed, thus utterly destroying the four fiends and restoring the crystals to their former splendor. In the game's epilogue, it is stated that Garland awaits the four Warriors of Light as they return to the present, but if he has regained his honor, or still harnesses evil within his heart, it is left all but a mystery. Garland is an intriguing villain, for one in that the player doesn't learn his true intentions until the very end of the game. Because he is encountered at the beginning, many players will brush him off as just the first of many evil dudes to be slain. Yet it is because of this battle that Garland is made the source of many of the game's troubles. Garland, injured, humiliated, and desperate, openly accepts this dark power and aims to wield it to destroy not just the Warriors of Light, but the entire world and even time as we know it. Garland, due to his importance in the game's plot and the lack of any true protagonist, has come to be the representative for the original Final Fantasy. He has served this role by appearing in many of the franchise's spin-off titles, such as the Dissidia series of fighting games. Released in 2022, the action RPG Stranger of Paradise Final Fantasy Origin serves as a retelling of the first game, with greater focus on Garland's history and how he came to be corrupted by chaos. While this sheds greater light on this dark adversary, we'll save the revelations of that tale for some other time. The original Final Fantasy maintains a simple combat system that most anyone that has played a turn-based RPG will feel right at home with. When entering into combat, players choose from a list of options: Fight, which attacks with the equipped weapon; Magic, which casts a spell; Drink, which uses a potion; Item, which uses the ability assigned to an item such as a staff; and Run, which attempts to escape the battle. After choosing these commands, the characters, including the enemies, will act according to their agility stat. This continues until all members of one side are defeated, or until all characters have acted, in which case a new turn occurs. As players defeat enemies, they gain experience points and collect gold and other valuables. With enough experience points, characters will level up, which will increase their stats, increase their total health, and be able to cast spells more frequently. Final Fantasy borrows a magic system common with many tabletop RPGs of the day. Magic spells are divided into 8 different levels of increasing power, and on each level are 4 unique spells. Characters are able to cast a limited amount of spells of each strength, which increases per their level. For instance, a low-level character may only use level 1 spells 3 times, while a higher level character may use level 1 spells 8 times, and so on. All spells must be purchased at stores or acquired by exploring. Spells are not learned by leveling up. Spell charges are only replenished via resting. either at an inn or using items on the world map, such as a tent. There are no magic points either, which were popularized by Dragon Quest and have become the staple for JRPGs today. Largely, that's all there is to the original Final Fantasy. Players construct their party, delve into dungeons in search of treasure and to defeat enemies, always aiming to improve their party's chances of survival by acquiring better gear, higher levels, improved stats, and so on. And honestly, when you get right down to it, JRPGs haven't really changed all that much in the 3 decades that have passed. The first Final Fantasy is also infamous for its jarring difficulty, especially its original Famicom and NES releases. There aren't any items that can revive a character from death, for instance, so if a character falls in battle, the player must rely on rare magic or paying a fee at a church located within a town. Dungeons can be lengthy excursions full of danger and deceit. There are false chests that can lead to brutal fights when opened, enemies that prevent you from fleeing, and even a narrow passageway that has a guaranteed encounter when stepping on each of its tiles. There are also no save points within dungeons either, thus no way to restore magic without completely exiting. While certainly not the most difficult RPG out there, these elements all combine to ensure Final Fantasy attains the label of being Nintendo hard. Of course, skirmishes with enemies are elevated into such thrilling encounters thanks to the memorable battle theme. The song begins with a quick flourish, followed by a now iconic driving bass. A simple melody then repeats itself, followed by a section in which the notes seemingly duel each other with contrasting chords, simulating a melee of sorts, fought with sounds rather than swords. The track then starts over from the melody, creating an earworm that you'll be humming along while trading blows with your adversaries. It was extremely important to Uematsu that the battle theme be simple, yet pleasant to listen to, as it is by far the song heard the most by the player. It also generates excitement, getting the player's blood pumping as they head into combat. As discussed previously, Final Fantasy wasn't given extremely high hopes of success. Square had modest hopes for the game and projected that the game would sell at most only 200,000 copies. Sakaguchi, of course, fully believed in the skill of his team and took it upon himself to ensure that the title had the greatest odds of success. Sakaguchi pled with Square to manufacture at least 500,000 copies of Final Fantasy for the Nintendo Famicom. However, the company stood steadfast with their original projection of 200,000. In order to drum up interest for the game, and to convince Square to produce more units, Sakaguchi took copies of the game to every publication that he could contact at the time. Many magazines refused to review it, but Famicom Shushin, later known as Famitsu, gave Final Fantasy extensive coverage, and it would be in part due to this that the Japanese video game magazine grew to be the most widely read and revered of its kind in the Japanese market. Of course, Final Fantasy proved to be a stellar hit, with Square successfully shipping over 520,000 copies in Japan alone. The game almost instantly became Square's most profitable title, and Sakaguchi and his team were catapulted from being despised by others in the company to outright heroes. A sequel was also immediately greenlit. Final was perhaps the furthest word to describe this fantasy role-playing game. With all the success the original release had, there of course had to be ports. A major reason for these multiple releases, though, was because the original game largely didn't work. Yes, the game was absolutely playable, but the original Final Fantasy is littered with so many bugs and glitches that it's a wonder that it didn't all just crash and burn. Many of these bugs render some magic completely useless, and others improperly use various stats. For example, the intelligence stat is absolutely useless in the original release. Spells are supposed to be stronger based on the amount of intelligence a character has. However, because it is never actually calculated in the game's formula, a low-level character is just as effective in using a spell as a max-level character. This also makes the red mage much more powerful than intended, as their intelligence stat, which is much lower than their white and black counterparts, is never taken into consideration, and thus their casting strength is just as good. Critical hits also do not work properly. The game was designed with each weapon possessing a critical hit rate, which would provide the likelihood of that weapon dealing extra damage. However, the game instead ignores this rate and factors a separate number, the weapon's index number, to determine the critical hit chances. This results in early game weapons, which have a very low index number, to almost never hit for critical damage, while late game weapons almost always land critical hits due to their high index number. This bug is so profound that it's never been properly patched in any port of the game, leading many to state that it's not much of a bug anymore, as just an example of poor game design. As for magic spells, many are coded in ways in which they always miss, have the reverse effect, or don't work at all whatsoever. This can lead to a lot of frustration for first-time players, as they may be confused if they're doing something wrong. In 1989, Dragon Quest released in North America to critical acclaim. Initially, Enix had deemed the English release a commercial failure, but Nintendo struck a deal with the company to provide a copy of the game for all subscribers of their magazine, Nintendo Power, for a limited time. This boosted profits immensely for both companies. Suddenly, Dragon Quest, dubbed Dragon Warrior in the States, was in tens of thousands of new homes, and the magazine, which served as essentially a 100-page monthly advertisement for Nintendo-related products, too was being enjoyed by thousands of new customers. By the end of the year, Dragon Warrior was the third best-selling video game in North America, behind only the Game Boy releases of Nintendo's own Tetris and Super Mario Land titles. With Dragon Quest striking gold, Square saw this as the prime opportunity to bring their own JRPG hit stateside. Sakaguchi reached out to Nintendo directly, and while a similar deal with Nintendo Power didn't manifest, Nintendo of America agreed to take it upon themselves to write the English translation of the game. On July 12, 1990, Nintendo published Final Fantasy for the NES, and while it wouldn't reach the heights of Dragon Warrior, the game helped secure the popularity of turn-based RPGs in the West. Largely, the game remained the exact same from its Japanese counterpart, complete with the bugs, but Nintendo of America's stronger stance on censoring Judeo-Christian imagery led to some minor changes, such as the churches having their crosses removed. Magic names too were shortened, though out of necessity, as the original program only allowed for a 4-character limit on names. The first real port of Final Fantasy came in 1989 on the MSX2, a home computer system popular in Japan and developed by ASCII Corporation and Microsoft. This version had little changes aside from enhanced graphics, music and sound, and faster loading times. After a few more Japanese exclusive ports, Final Fantasy Origins released in 2002 in Japan for the Sony PlayStation and arrived the following year in North America and Europe. The game was a top-to-bottom remake of the first 2 Final Fantasy titles and marked the first time the European market ever saw an official release of these 2 games. Origins possessed all new graphics, a soundtrack re-recorded to take advantage of the more advanced hardware, beautifully crafted cutscenes that told the stories in all new ways, a memo save function so that players could take a break at any time, and art galleries of behind-the-scenes materials. In 2004, the first 2 titles returned to Nintendo consoles, this time in the form of Final Fantasy I and II, Dawn of Souls. This collection largely maintained the additions of the PlayStation release of Origins, minus the FMV cutscenes, but added 4 additional dungeons, a full bestiary with information on all the game's foes, and some other minor tweaks. In 2007, the PSP received its own port, itself being largely a combination of Origins and Dawn of Souls. The game included the FMV cutscenes, as well as the bonus dungeons and bestiary, and further enhanced graphics. This would remain the pinnacle of Final Fantasy remakes, with most all future ports being of this particular version, until the 2021 release of the Final Fantasy Pixel Remaster. This collection contains the first 6 Final Fantasy games, all featuring revamped graphics, soundtracks, and even retooled gameplay. This collection attempts to unify the original 6 games so that they flow more seamlessly. Unfortunately, the Pixel Remaster of the original game does not include the bonus dungeons, bestiary, cutscenes, or artwork that versions such as the PSP and Game Boy Advance releases had. For those wanting to jump into Final Fantasy's first game today, I would recommend the PSP release, as it offers the most cohesive version of the game while maintaining much of the original identity. This game isn't easy to obtain though, as it's only available via the PSP online store or as a physical cartridge. Final Fantasy Origins is a good alternative, though it too has limited availability on the PS3 online store or as a physical copy. The good news is that Square Enix, surprisingly, still sells the physical PlayStation copy on their online store. Purists may also seek a NES Classic Mini Console, in which the original copy is included along with 29 other classic games. While the Pixel Remaster is convenient, the fact that it doesn't have the extra content makes it a hard recommendation over others. Like so many of its contemporaries, Final Fantasy never set out to change the world. The game was simply a labor of love by a group of talented Japanese game designers aiming to achieve the very best that their skills and their imaginations could get them. Had it failed, it would have been a glorious swan song for Sakaguchi to retire on, a work of art that compiled everything that made him fall in love with gaming in the first place. Its success, however, was proof that Sakaguchi wasn't alone in having that passion for adventure, and gamers the world over yearned to explore a fantastical world and slay wondrous beasts. Final Fantasy enamored gamers with its simplicity. Its story, while more complex than the standard fare of the time, was still easy to digest. The combat was challenging, yet often fair, and always engaging and addictive. The music transported players to a world that they had never dreamed of before, reaching cinematic highs that were rare on primitive 8-bit consoles. Many of the melodies that Nobuo Uematsu wrote in the mid-80s are still routinely used in the games today, and are instantly recognizable to gamers 35 years later. As with many sequels during the 8-bit era, Sakaguchi and his team sought to go in a new direction for the second entry in the Final Fantasy series, leading to both thrilling and disastrous results. Stay tuned, as next time we will dive into the development of Final Fantasy II.